I feel like crap today. And I look like crap too, so I don't want to be on camera. And I don't want to use my 3D avatars for this video because, well, the topic is a bit too serious for that maybe, and I don't think I've much in the way of video game footage I can just put behind this video without it being kind of stupid considering the point I'm trying to drive at. So you get this, my derped face avatar and some Spectrum animations. Feel free to second tab me while you listen. This is all the visuals I have for you on this one, I'm afraid. But please do listen. Don't just react to what you think I'm going to say about this stuff. I know this is a hot button topic for some of you. I know you might assume you know what I'm going to say because, well, I'm Australian, or you've seen my videos before, or you think I'm this or that politically. But please just try to listen, because we aren't going to get anywhere with this unless people start listening to one another. Hello again, I am Blunty. I feel like chances are pretty decent that if you're watching this video and are someone curious about the debate around firearm control in the USA specifically, you probably know these next two words. Port Arthur. I've thought about making a video like this countless times, pretty much after every American mass shooting that gets broad media coverage actually, but it's honestly so exhausting just watching it happen every single time. It's exhausting how the debate is always identical. The same people saying the same things in the same ways. Nobody listens. People just sing the same song. They dance the same routines. They march to the same rhythm. Everybody in chorus in the same choir, and nothing ever changes. It's ridiculous. It's cyclical. It's buffoonery, and I don't understand why you won't do something. From the outside, one is forced to ask, are Americans just stupid? Are they dumb? Can they not just act? Do they not see the need to do something? Why won't they just do something? It's heartbreaking. It keeps happening over and over and over, and they just won't even try to stop it. This year alone, 2023, there has been an average of 1.4 mass shootings every single day in the USA. That's more than one mass shooting incident a day for those of you struggling with the math. And a mass shooting is considered where a single person with a gun murders 4 or more people in a single incident. 130 mass shootings have occurred in the USA already, and we're only 89 days into 2023. And every time one of these events gets global media coverage, Port Arthur starts trending on social media. These days, Port Arthur is a tourist attraction. You could drive there in less than 90 minutes from where I grew up. I went there several times in my youth, a couple of times with family on day trips, a few more times on several school excursions. It's an important part of Tasmania's history and Australia's history in general, or at least our colonial history, you know, the bit after the British got here and decided to claim all this land as their own and started murdering all the blackfellas that were here. I was taught a lot about Port Arthur my whole youth. Port Arthur was among the first 10 penal colonies established in Australia and the first one in Tasmania. And even today, there are buildings still standing in Hobart, that'd be the capital city of Tasmania, where you can see the thumbprints of the convicts and the telltale arrow markings in the bricks that convicts made that built our capital city. And some terrible, and I mean terrible, hauntingly awful things happened in Port Arthur back when it was an operating penal colony. I was taught about these things as a kid too. But long after that chapter of its history closed, a new terrible thing happened in what was now a popular tourist attraction and historical museum attraction. I was 17 years old at the time. On Sunday, the 28th of April, 1996, a 23-year-old male entered this tourist attraction. He was carrying 2 firearms. One was an L1A1 self-loading rifle. That is a light machine gun that was used by the Australian Army and many other former British colonies in their armed forces. The second gun was a Colt AR-15, a magazine-fed, gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle. The AR-15 is a modified version of the fully automatic M16 assault rifle, which for decades saw very common use in many militaries. But I don't need to explain that to you, do I? I'm betting you all know the name AR-15. The AR-15 is a trademark we've all grown to know very well. We're all very used to seeing it in the news reports coming out of the USA specifically. Using these two weapons, the man responsible for what we now call the Port Arthur massacre shot dead 35 people and wounded 18 more. 53 people shot on that day by a single man, a man who planned this attack well in advance, a man who was, in fact, captured alive, and once captured, he continually, gleefully, by all reports, asked to know exactly how many people he had killed that day. The gun control debate in Australia wasn't new by that day. In fact, it had been getting ever more fiercely debated for at least a decade beforehand. And I remember the same kinds of rhetoric we still hear today after every single mass shooting the USA has. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. You know the kinds of stuff. Politicians on the payroll of pro-gun lobbyists, screams of the right for self-defense, how only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun, and if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. And just like in the USA, organizations like the so-called Christian Lobby, who were a conservative right-wing Christian advocacy organization in Australia, and even the NRA, yes, the American NRA interfering with Australian politics, were funding the lobbies and attempting to manipulate political policy, media attention and public opinion. Just like they do today. The NRA are insidious. However, Australians are, it seems, smarter than Americans. We, as a nation, decided that we never wanted to see a horror on this scale happen to us ever again, and we did something about it. Immediately. This one event, this one horrifying event, those 35 murdered people, including children, was already too much. We drew the line. Very rapidly, under the then Prime Minister John Howard, the national and state governments cooperated and led the development and implementation of stricter gun control laws. We created the National Firearms Agreement, which for the first time saw a consistent nationwide set of laws around gun ownership. It restricted the private ownership of semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic shotguns, and pump-action shotguns. It brought in a national and uniform firearms licensing arrangement, and it was implemented with bipartisan support by the Commonwealth in every state and every territory. Both sides of the political aisle decided this is something that needed to be done, and it needed to be done now. There was a mandatory buyback scheme implemented to get rid of the existing, now more tightly controlled weapons. Owners were paid to turn in their guns. More than 643,000 firearms were handed in, and the former owners were compensated at a cost that totaled up to about 300 million Australian bucks. There is a myth that I hear repeated often, that we simply banned gun ownership. Guns are banned in Australia. Americans love to scream that about us, especially in debates around gun ownership and how we're defenseless against our government if they ever decide to turn against us and we have no guns to fight back, which is just a ridiculous argument that I'm not going to go into in this video because it just holds no water at all. But yeah, the chant is that the government took away our guns and we don't have freedom anymore. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's simply not true. It's a lie. What happened was there were just new laws that controlled the types of guns that could be legally and appropriately owned and used by individual civilians. People who legitimately need guns can still get them. Farmers, for example, they need guns. Certain kinds of private security, they need guns. In fact, right now, it's reported more private citizens, more people in Australia own guns than was the case before the Port Arthur massacre and the subsequent changes in our gun ownership laws. We don't even have fewer guns now. But incidents of multi-victim shootings, armed robberies, and even gun-related suicides all went down, stayed down. Sensible gun control, of course, hasn't stopped violent crime from happening or even shootings from happening. but not letting just like anyone at all who wants the type of gun made specifically for and solely designed to kill as many people as possible as quickly as possible has meant we simply do not see the kinds of horrific mass shooting tragedies the USA sees constantly. In fact, every day. Because there is no legitimate reason a regular civilian needs an assault rifle. And it's true, while we Aussies never had such a thing as the Second Amendment in our own national constitution, and gun fetishization is not quite the same cultural thing here as it is in America, which is just, it's so bizarre from the outside in. Do you guys even realize that, you Americans listening? The way you guys fetishize gun ownership and guns in general? Can you afford yourself some perspective to look at that from the outside in and see how truly, horrifyingly bizarre that is? But even with the Second Amendment, it's absurd for someone to try and use that to excuse what happens in the USA every single day. The exact wording of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The interpretation of that passage has been abused. We can have the same old debate, if you like, about what kinds of guns were around when that was written, or their inability to predict the kinds of guns that would come, or we can talk about the intent of the phrase well-regulated militia, and how that was specifically talking about state-based, organized, and regulated armed forces for the purpose of state security, not talking about just any Tom, Dick, and Harry in the street. And we can talk about how bearing arms can be so very loosely interpreted as to mean even that a civilian could have the right to own a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead attached. I mean, that's technically being armed too, isn't it, for the purposes of defense? Technically, that's also protected under the Second Amendment, right? But it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, doesn't it? Ludicrous hyperbole aside, in fact, there are already stricter regulations for certain types of guns, at least in some states, that do regulate what types of guns an average civilian can and should be able to own and operate. Certain sniper rifles, for example, require extremely restricted licenses in California. I learned about that one from Mythbusters when they were talking about the, the Barat 50 cal? Am I saying that right? Big gun, big boom. Made Jamie giggle. So, are we on the same page yet? Gun control is not the same as taking away your guns or completely disarming the civilian population. And if you honestly believe that the difference it makes between owning a semi-automatic assault rifle versus a bolt-loading hunting rifle is the difference between a corrupt government being able to storm in and take your land away from you, I don't think you're very attached to reality, because that's just not how this works. And just for the record, by the way, speaking personally, I'm not anti-gun myself. I personally find guns very interesting from a mechanical and engineering point of view especially. They're kind of cool mechanically, and the way they're designed and refined is really interesting to me. I approve of legitimate uses for firearms, like hunting, for example. In fact, going hunting with a rifle is something that's been on my bucket list for years. I don't know whether I'll ever get to do it, but I like the idea of connecting to that more primitive human experience of hunting something you're going to eat. Of course, I approve of guns for things like farm stock management and wildlife culling for environmental management. Guns are useful for law enforcement, of course, and licensed and trained private security too, naturally. I have even personally spent part of my own youth being trained in target shooting. And I was even pretty good at it too, for the record. I'm a good shot, even if social anxiety issues kept me from pursuing it in competitions and whatnot, despite the encouraging of the bloke who was teaching me how to shoot. I was taught how to use and how to respect guns. The bloke who taught me was a retired police sergeant, and one day he even brought in some of his own personal gun collection to show me. And I still have really specific memories of him showing me his World War II era German Luger, possibly one of the most famous historical handguns, and I was fascinated by its iconic toggle lock mechanism. And apparently the one he was showing me was a legitimate World War II piece of memorabilia too. It was apparently a trophy one of his family members who served in World War II passed down to him. Once I even got to shoot off a whole bunch of otherwise restricted, essentially illegal firearms as part of a marketing stunt for an action movie, including several semi and fully automatic rifles and pistols and sawn-off pump-action shotguns and all this kind of crazy stuff. The kinds of guns that are only legally ownable by a company because they were used specifically for movie and TV productions, which apparently is one of the legitimate uses Australian firearms laws provide for. I should have looked it up before I started recording, but I particularly liked the semi-automatic rifle that is like the official armament of Australian armed forces. It was very light and comfortable and compact, and the recoil was extremely controllable. I quite liked it. Someone out there with Australian armed forces experience is going to tell me which one that was, but yeah. In any case, that particular video where I was shooting off all those guns is no longer on YouTube. Can you predict why? Point is, personally speaking, I think guns are fine. They're interesting, they're fun, they're useful. But guns are also tools which are made with only one purpose. They are designed specifically to do one thing, and that's kill something else. And to ignore that fact, when we talk about who gets to own the ones which are like super duper good at that task, like for example, semi-automatic assault rifles, which are not only designed to kill, like all guns are, but specifically designed to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Well, it's not just absurd, or naive, or stupid, but horrifying. Civilians simply do not need this kind of gun. There is no circumstance where that's a useful tool to have, a justifiable tool to have. So it's just horrifying that civilians are allowed to own guns like that. And it is undeniably past time for some smarter gun control regulations, my American friends. So very long past time. Please do something. Do something.